study that Citigroup released in September of 2020 on the costs of racism to the US economy. And Dana is currently the chief economist at the Conference Board, and she's also the head of the US Economy Strategy and Finance Center there. And the Conference Board is a nonprofit business finance economics nonprofit with over 1,000 members in 60 countries. That very important place for research and thinking on economics. And before that, though, she was the US North America economist at Citigroup in the research division, and then a global economist there. And in fact, she was in that position, sitting on the diversity committee of the research division when COVID hit and when George Floyd was killed and the racial justice protests broke out all around the country. And Citi, like every other group at that time, was thinking very hard, how do we understand this and how do we respond, very importantly. And Dana, being in a research division, thought we should respond as we do in a research division with a paper that explains what's going on here and why people are so upset and why people are in the streets, and make an economic analysis that helps explain what lies behind this outburst of anger. And COVID, as you know, exposed many issues with respect to disparities in healthcare and access to healthcare and education, underlying conditions, things that were always there. But the interesting and inspiring thing about the study that Dana has done is that they sat down to quantify it and to explore and to explain how the disparities that exist today have their roots in the institution of slavery and the legacy of slavery, and to try to actually gather the big picture and quantify it so people could see it very clearly. And so that was the groundbreaking nature of the Citigroup report. It was received very well. It's frequently quoted. Susan Rice, Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell have quoted it. You heard Bishop Eugene Sutton of Maryland quoted in his presentation on reparations. You heard Jim Stowe, the head of Montgomery County Human Rights Office, quote it when he was speaking to us not so long ago. And just last week, it was quoted again on Morning Joe in a discussion of the issues with respect to the cost to the entire society and economy of continuing racial discrimination. So I know that Dana has boiled down 104 some pages into slides that will give us the key elements of her work. And then I look forward to a really interesting discussion. So Dana, let me just say, thank you so much for joining us today and welcome. We're ready to listen.
Thank you, Reverend Doris. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to share with this congregation. I'm here as a private individual, not necessarily representing the conference board, but you know, the CEO is supportive of me participating in this. So I'm just going to share some slides, and Reverend Doris, at any point, once I hit my limit, just tell me to wrap it up, and I will. And we can do the Q&A.
Okay, well, please just call me Ann, though, Dana. Please call me Ann.
Sure. Sure. So I want to make sure that we have enough time for conversation. Okay. Let's see. Let's do this. Okay, hopefully everyone can see what I'm sharing. Okay, great. So I thought it would just be important to start off with, you know, the first sort of the report that just talks about the history of racial economic gaps in the US. We're defining gaps as differences in either metrics or outcomes between groups. And in the report, we mainly focused on differences between white households and families and Black households and families. And I think, you know, it made sense at the time because of a lot of the, you know, many groups were involved in protests and last year, but, you know, a lot of it was sparked by the unfortunate deaths of several Black people while interacting with the police, and also amid COVID, as Anne mentioned, where a lot of these issues just kind of, were just laid bare, things that have been around for a long time. And one point we tried to make in the report was that racial gaps are not new. Gaps are the residuals of, hundreds of years of slavery in the US, and then, Jim Crow laws thereafter, the reign of terror, and, legacies of just inequality along a number of metrics. And a lot of people ask, well, what does it mean to say something systemic or structural? Well, I guess the best way to explain it is that even if you have a change in the law, and indeed the law supported slavery and segregation, but even if you change those laws, people's attitudes may not necessarily change. And even when attitudes do change over time, thankfully, behaviors may not. It just becomes embedded in the way that we do things, and we don't even realize that actions are contributing to gaps between different groups of people, gaps that are harmful, that is. So the idea that past laws, attitudes, and behaviors can become structurally embedded. And there are lots of racial gaps out there. I just list kind of 3 buckets here, and of course it's not exhaustive. Economic, health and well-being, social, economic in terms of homeownership, different occupations that people are in, different levels of education and access to education, wages, income, and wealth. I mean, those are a lot of the economic gaps that we think about and the ones that we focus on in this paper. But indeed, there are gaps around health and well-being, including access to affordable healthcare, COVID-19 in terms of different rates of deaths among different groups, insecurities in terms of housing and food, even access to vaccines. There's just kind of at least, a lot of disparities there. I mean, some of it is because of distrust among different racial groups because of historical reasons, and some of it's just not being able to gain access. Either you don't have a computer or your computer's not fast enough to get into the system, etc. But also health and well-being gaps in terms of nutrition, and sorry, my screen is locked here, and poverty, and then social, things with regards to affordable housing, political power, of voting rights, especially. I was reading yesterday where there are a lot of states, state and local governments, Republican state and local governments, that are looking to add voting restrictions. Some of them make sense, some of them not so much, and are kind of blatant ways to potentially advocate voter suppression, but also environment, where I remember when I was at Citi, we did a huge report showing how housing, where poorer persons are more often affected by environmental disasters, right? Because their housing is in low-lying areas. And that was just so clear with Hurricane Katrina. And even, apart from natural disasters, that oftentimes, things like garbage dumps are next to poor neighborhoods, et cetera. But then also a lot of gaps in terms of incarceration and policing. We address different, very lightly some of the health and well-being and the social aspects, but most of the report was economic. And again, the reason for that was because Citigroup is a bank, and our audience includes institutional investors, and the attempt was to make an economic argument about why these gaps are essentially forcing the US economy to not perform at its optimal potential, and that we're leaving a lot of money on the table. So how did we quantify some of these economic gaps? Well, here's just a snapshot of the 4 gaps that we looked at. We looked at gaps in terms of wages and income, access to housing credit, access to higher education, and also fair and equitable lending for entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs. And when we added up all of these bits and pieces, it added up to $16 trillion over the last 20 years. And again, 20 years is only, we were limited by data. Before that, there really wasn't reliable data by race. So imagine if these gaps, extend back 100 or more years, which they do, many of them. It's just tons of money. And just to give you an idea of what $16 trillion looks like, if you added up the economies of China and India together, that's, $16 trillion. That's all the output and money generated in two giant countries with, a couple of billion people involved. So it's a lot of money. But then, to be optimistic, we said, well, what if we close these gaps immediately, right? If today we were able to close all these gaps, how much money would you generate over the next 5 years? And 5 years, may seem like an odd number, but a lot of that was just the fact that we had this global economic model. We were only able to forecast out 5 years. So a little bit of, sausage making there. But the point is, by 2025, how much money could we generate? It was something close to $5 trillion, right? And in terms of GDP growth, that's like a 0.5 percentage point of GDP growth a year. And that's really amazing. Before the pandemic, the US economy was growing just under 3%. So if we added, 0.5%, we'd be at that 3% or more. So that's pretty significant. And certainly it's quite significant now post-pandemic when we're trying to recover. So let's just take a little bit of time to look at how we came up with these numbers of $16 trillion. So first we looked at wage gaps across race and gender. And the benchmark was $1, meaning what a white male person is making. And then we looked at how other racial and gender groups were faring. And so Asian males and most recently Asian women are actually making a lot more than your average white male worker. But when you look at women in general, they're making about 80 cents on the dollar. So I'm not making this up. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So these are government figures. And the numbers are pretty sad here. And then when we look at different racial groups, when we look at Black men and women and Hispanic men and women, the numbers just get more and more morose. Sorry, it's so tiny. I'll just tell everybody. I did send over the deck, so Anne can share it later. But essentially, again, women in general, about 80 cents on the dollar. White women, again, about just under 80 cents. Black males, just about 80 cents. Black women, it's more like 70 cents, right? And for Hispanic men and women, it's, I'm having trouble seeing, Hispanic men, it's just above 70 cents. But for Hispanic women, it's just above 60 cents. So there are pretty big gaps in terms of wages. And so we said, well, what if we close these gaps, right? So we looked at, well, how much income is a person leaving on the table or losing or not gaining over the course of the last 20 years. And the chart on the left-hand side shows the amount in gaps, right? So if you're a white female, you didn't earn about $175,000 over the last 20 years. I mean, that's enough to, put a nice down payment on a house, right? And in some cases, actually buy a house. For Black men and women, for Black men, it's just under, it's like 225. Black women, it's about 300,000, right? Hispanic men, also about 300,000. Hispanic women, about 375. So it's a lot of money that these people didn't earn. So we said, what if we close those gaps 20 years ago and we added it up across all the people in these different racial groups? And so for Black males, it's $1.1 trillion. And for Black women, it's $1.6 trillion. So adding that up, that's $2.7 trillion from the Black population of income that could have been generated over the last 20 years if we didn't have gaps between what they were making and what your average white male was making. So that's a lot of money. But what about, a lot of people would push back and say, well, it really depends upon what job you have, and you're absolutely right. Here, this is telling us that when we look at where many Black workers are working, which professions they are in, many of them are in professions that are pretty low wage, right? So for example, transportation and material moving, food preparation, personal care services, healthcare support, sales. So that is a function of some of its past inability to enter into certain disciplines, but also implications in terms of education and personal choices, as well as location. And meanwhile, you see very few Black people in professions that tend to have higher wages. And so, this is a huge issue. And so when we think about occupations that are also susceptible to automation, Black people find themselves in these sectors, right? So if your sector is susceptible to automation, it means that you're at a higher risk of losing your job or being in a very low wage portion of that industry. So the good news is that the data show and research shows that people who have more education tend to be able to go into disciplines and jobs, industries where you can have a higher wage, and that there certainly is a premium to having a college education or training after high school. So again, let's think about the education gap. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of the benefit of having a higher education, or rather a more advanced degree. So here, if you have a bachelor's degree, over the course of a 40-year career, you're going to make $1.3 million more than a person who just has a high school degree. And if you have an advanced degree, like a master's or PhD or medical degree or a legal degree or accounting or anything that requires something more than a bachelor's degree, you have the potential of making $2 million more over the course of a lifetime. So that suggests that there's definitely a benefit to higher education and also training beyond high school. However, it's very difficult to get to that point if you don't have equal access to a high quality education when you're a child. So here we show that if you look at a school district that has mostly non-white students versus mostly white students, there's a gap in funding. And a lot of that funding is because of the way that schools are funded. So for example, I live in New Jersey, and all the schools are funded through property taxes. So if you live in a wealthy town, most likely you're going to have really great public schools because those property taxes are going towards the school. And also New Jersey does have something called sharing, where, for example, part of the money that I pay in taxes goes to my town, and part of it also goes to Newark, which is a very poor city. But even still, the schools in my town are probably a lot better because the parents are just in general wealthier and they can bring more resources to the school and direct more resources. And so, depending upon where you live can dictate how good your education is, and consequently, how far you can potentially go in terms of acquiring an advanced degree, and then what industry you can go in, and whether or not you can go into a higher wage element of that industry and earn a lot of money in order to do things like buy a home or start a business. So it's this whole continuum that we're seeing where all these things are really mixed together. And so we looked at the percentage of people, all people who have a bachelor's degree. So this is a chart on the left-hand side. And among people ages 25 and older, at least 35% of the population has a degree, advanced degree. Among Black persons, it's 26%. So we said, what if we raise that 26% for Black people by 10 percentage points to 35%? What would that mean? And so the chart on the right-hand side shows, well, if we raise the percentage of people who have a bachelor's degree, Black persons, and we add that up for each person, that's roughly $90 billion of additional money that could have been generated over the last 20 years. And let's say that they obtain a degree that's higher than a bachelor's. Well, that's $113 billion. So as you can see, there's a lot of money here that's just not being generated because of these differences and these gaps. And so I mentioned that housing is a huge issue in terms of determining education, and consequently education in determining jobs and wages. So let's look at the racial housing gap. Now, this chart, I'm sorry, it's not up to date. It's through the first quarter of 2020. But even still, I took a look at the data through the middle of 2020, I'm sorry, to the end of 2020, and the gaps are still there, where it's Black homeowners, Black persons are the least likely to own a home relative to other racial groups. And this dates back more than 100 years, because more than 100 years ago, Black families were not allowed to live wherever they wanted to live. For example, the National Association of Realtors threatened to rescind the licenses of realtors who showed a Black family a home in a white neighborhood. And so, and also you had laws at the time that, and insurance rulings, underwriting rules that prevented Black people from owning homes wherever they wanted to, and even it made it difficult for them to own homes in their own neighborhood. And so you had something called redlining, where literally they would take a pen on a map and draw a red line where all the Black people were and said, you can't live outside of this red line. And so that prevented a lot of people from buying homes.
And partly because Citibank wouldn't loan to them.
Is that right?
Well,
yeah, I mean, exactly. And that's the other thing, like lenders, including Citibank. I mean, Citibank also played a role in the slave trade. They underwrote the ship. So, so very mixed feelings. But all that was together. You had the laws, you had the realtors, and you had the insurers, and you had the lenders who were working against allowing Black people to become homeowners. And the reason why homeownership is so important is because when you think about wealth and the assets that most people own, most people don't own stocks or bonds, but most people do own a home if they're going to own an asset. And owning a home allows you to generate equity. And also, once you pass away, you can pass that equity, that home, onto the next generation as an inheritance. That inheritance can be used to build wealth for the next generation. So if you don't have this transformation, intergenerational transformation of wealth, because you were never allowed to own a home, that presents a problem for your descendants. And that's what we're seeing now. And we're also seeing that because many Black people are relegated to these areas that were not invested in, that were highly underdeveloped and poor, then it just creates things like poverty and poor education and housing, all those kinds of things. So you can see how all these things are just kind of melding together. And this is what I was talking about. When we look at Black families, they own the least amount of housing wealth, clearly because they're less likely to own a house. And then also even families that are Black homeowners, they experience the least in terms of home price appreciation. In fact, their homes depreciated over the last 20 years or so. And that's because many of those homes are located in areas that are depressed. Meanwhile, for many white borrowers, they saw appreciation of their homes. So even for Black homeowners, there really wasn't a benefit because of the location. And in the report, we showed that even wealthier Black homeowners tend to live in Black neighborhoods that are predominantly Black and have lower home values for a variety of reasons. So there's also been some really great research that says, well, what if we take into account a lot of different factors, right? So what your education is, if you're employed, how old you are, your FICO score, if you're married, and you still have a 17% gap that's just not explained. And probably, you know, a decent portion of that 17% gap is bias. So for example, even in most recent times, I think Facebook was sued or at least came under pressure for its algorithm, which was pointing families away from quote unquote Black neighborhoods. And it didn't even realize that it was happening until someone brought it up. So, you know, bias in housing is still very present, unfortunately. So we said, well, what if we close that gap that we see among Black homeowners and raise the percentage to that of that we see among white homeowners? Well, then you potentially have 770,000 additional Black homeowners over the last 20 years. And the combination of the home purchases would be about 154 billion. And then if you also added in, you know, all the things that go along with a house, buying furniture, appliances, if you live in the suburbs, most likely a car, well, that's another $65 billion in consumption. So that's a lot of consumption that can be generated just from people owning homes. So the last gap, well, second to last I'm going to talk about is business investment, where we look at Black entrepreneurs. And I know this is really tiny, but basically this is just showing all the sources of where Black entrepreneurs get money from. And actually they do better than their white counterparts in terms of gathering money from their own savings and from friends and family. And so it's not a lack of effort or even expertise, but still, when you look at other sources of financing, they don't do as well. And indeed, this chart shows that for each type of funding along the spectrum, Black entrepreneurs, even if they get the money that they're asking for, they don't get the amount that they asked for. Right, so the gray bars are showing that they did not receive the funding that they requested, and that's along every point of the spectrum. So that's a problem, and you know, we made a point that, especially when it comes to investing in Black businesses, there's still quite a bit of bias, and especially with respect to venture capitalism and angel investors, simply because the group of investors tends not to look like the Black entrepreneur, and they may not understand what they are trying to do, and also they have difficulty, these investors have difficulty differentiating between a viable Black entrepreneur and one who isn't viable in terms of receiving the investment. And we talked about that in the report, which was just really astounding. But let's say that all of these Black-owned businesses received the investments that they asked for, then we would generate something along the lines of $13 trillion of additional revenue, and then the ability to add roughly 6 million people a year in terms of employees. So, I mean, that's just really astounding how many people you can hire per year. And we think about the number of people who aren't working right now. It's roughly 9 million people who aren't working due to the pandemic. If we could, and imagine in the regular times, if we could add 6 million people a year, that would just be astounding in terms of the generation of income and potentially wealth and GDP and prosperity and well-being. So the reason why we looked at these 4 gaps is because it was important to understand these gaps in terms of contributing to the racial wealth gap, which is something that a lot of folks tend to write about. So if we look at household net worth, which is the chart on the left-hand side, and net worth is just, you know, assets minus liabilities, right? So when you look at net worth, white families have 8 times more wealth than your average Black family, and also the same for your average Hispanic family. So a lot of that is due to the fact that, you know, like I mentioned earlier, you have this gap in terms of inheritance, right? So if you don't have a home or assets to pass down to the next generation, then it makes it difficult to accumulate wealth. And even for households without inheritance, you can see that there's still, a pretty big gap between white households and Black households. And again, this is related to assets like housing. But we also found that Black families were less likely to participate in 401k plans, which is a pretty easy way to accumulate wealth over your working life. And also Black people are less likely to own stocks than white persons, which can tend to have pretty large gains. So, and these are just some more metrics. So we have the financial wealth by race, and we can see that Black and Hispanic families have much less wealth, financial wealth, relative to white and potentially Asian families. And the same thing with non-financial wealth, which includes things like non-residential property, primary residence, which is your house that you're living in, vehicles, etc. And a lot of this, a lot of the problems with wealth are also related to the fact that many Black people have poor credit scores, and a lot of that's linked to not having access to traditional banking. And so they're using alternative financial institutions such as payday lending, or just kind of stuffing money under the mattress, right? And so, and even for people who do have access to traditional banking, we wrote in the report that oftentimes the costs are higher. So why are the fees higher in a Black neighborhood relative to another neighborhood? Especially if that neighborhood, may not have as high of property value. So essentially it's a poorer neighborhood. You would imagine that, you're paying less for real estate and for having that branch in that region, in that neighborhood. But nonetheless, a lot of it's attributable to not having access to traditional banking. And then another big issue are student loans, where Black persons are more likely to have student loan debt than other racial ethnic groups. So this is among the people who actually have an advanced degree or a bachelor's degree. Black persons are, 43% of them have a student loan debt. And so that is a large part of the reason, part of the reason of that is that they're more likely to take out loans because they just don't have the accumulated wealth to pay for college, right? Or their parents were not able to save for them to go to college. So in order to do that, they take out loans. And we know that having outsized student loan debt can be an inhibitor to accumulating wealth, because if you're paying off your student loans, you're not necessarily saving for other things like buying a home or starting a business. So there are a lot of questions around what to do about student loan debt. I hope no one asked me a question about that, but certainly it is a huge issue, especially in the Black community. So I think this is the exciting part to move into our conversations. I have 2 slides here. The first is, what can governments and firms do? So I'm just going to run through these really quickly. Clearly there's monetary policy, financial inclusion, housing incentives, tax reform. Guaranteed income is kind of, I'm not advocating that, I'm just saying it's an option. There's invest in building wealth, and then preventing salary history bans. Among corporations, they can support diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, diverse slates, retention initiatives, reviewing firing plans, corporate social responsibility, developing metrics like counting the number of people that they have in different positions. Having the data helps you to identify if there's a problem and how to fix it. And then also adding Black board members. But I think for this group, for this congregation, I think this is the most important slide in terms of what individuals and nonprofits can do. And for individuals, the tack we took was, what can Black persons do for themselves? So, making sure that they are educating and training themselves. Embracing deferred gratification, which is actually something that Black people are quite used to, waiting for things, but especially when it comes to being to saving and investing, or pursuing higher education, those things in terms of deferred gratification. Embracing risk, risk meaning investments. You remember the chart that showed that Black people were less likely to own stocks. Well, embrace it. Also advocating for oneself, especially in the job market, and being mobile. Some of the data that we're doing at the conference board that shows that where a lot of the tech hubs are not necessarily where minority groups are, and so minority groups may need to move in order to take advantage of where the tech hubs are popping up. And then also, using your political power, which people did last year when they were protesting in the streets. But for nonprofits, a lot of it's going to be nonprofits and charitable organizations and religious organizations. A lot of it's going to be partnering, right? Either you're partnering with firms. So we talked about partnering with firms with things like inroads or SEO, which match individuals with corporations. Partnering with individuals, which is something that your congregation is doing, as well as partnering with communities. And then, partnering with governments, working together with state and local governments, even the federal government, to get things done. And then, educating and advocating. So I think at this time, I'll stop sharing and we can open it up for questions and discussion. Thank you for your time.
Wow, Dana, thank you so much. That was a really comprehensive but extremely clear summary that also painted a very clear picture of a situation that has to disturb us all. Thanks for offering at the end some ideas about things we can do. I would like to jump into the substance of your report, but first I want to take a moment to just, we talked about being people of faith, you are, we are, and I wondered if you could just say a word for us on how your faith has informed the work that you've been doing in this area.
Sure, absolutely. I go to a Baptist church, so I guess I'm a Baptist. I'm just, really grateful to God that He used me as an instrument to write this report. That He gave me this idea, and that He just gave me the ability to write 104 pages about a topic, a general subject that was very difficult to talk about, explain, and especially in the setting that we were in. But I didn't face any resistance. The senior management was extremely supportive, and they were excited that I raised my hand and volunteered to write the report. And I guess who better, being a Black person in America. But I'm just really honored to be used as a vessel in this way, and really, aim to help people to understand and educate, and to communicate it in a way that would make sense, especially for the financial world. But I've also seen how this report is kind of taking on a life of its own, where it's getting quoted all over the place, and a lot of people are finding it to be enlightening and useful. And that's the most important thing. So, I mean, I remember this is the last thing I'm going to say about this, but I remember years ago, I remember asking God, like, why in the world am I at a bank of all places? Why do you have me working here? And the answer is, well, He wants His people everywhere, right? So, and wherever we are, we have to let our light shine so that they might glorify our God in heaven. So.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you so much. I'll ask just one more question then. If Bill's willing, you can help me take questions from people. You can put your questions in the chat. You can raise your hand. Will you help me with that, Bill?
Certainly.
Okay. But the other question I wanted to ask you is this. You showed the interlinkages between all the different areas and how discrimination in one area, impedes progress in other areas. But if we were going to look for a policy focus to try to make a significant and relatively rapid change, where would you put attention amongst all the different things? And I know they're interrelated.
Sure. I think,
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all. Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, this isn't the best answer, but it's kind of like you could throw a lot at it at all different places. And so it really depends on who you are. So if suppose you're a corporation, there are highly specific things that you can do, and we outlined a lot of them in the report. And a lot of that's really about hiring, retention, and human capital, making sure that you are attracting the right people, the right folks in terms of their skill set and their education, et cetera, and experience, but that you're also taking diversity into account. And there's tons of research that shows that businesses that try to have diverse employees, be it race, age, experience, gender, just tend to do better, because you can avoid groupthink and you have these different perspectives that can come in and say, look at things from different angles so that you get a better outcome, instead of just coming at it from one angle and you have these blind spots. So when it comes to governments, a lot of it is tearing down walls that are impeding people. So one thing that was mentioned was salary history ban. So what is that? So essentially, I know in New York, at least in the city, if you are an employer, you cannot ask a person what their previous salary was. Now, if you're an employer, that may be frustrating, but the thing is that more often than not, women especially, were making a salary that was lower than it should have been. And even when I was at Citigroup, Citi had been admitted to underpaying women and Black people a few years back. And that was a really bold step. But the thing is that they made that step because a shareholder asked twice. So it wasn't something Citi did voluntarily. You had a very wealthy person who owned a bunch of shares that asked, well, what are you paying? And are you paying at the level that should be? And Citi was kind of forced to say, no, we're not, and then attempted to equalize. But that's not, everyone's not going to have a shareholder to do that. So it's kind of, if you ask a woman or a person of color what their previous salary was, and you base their new salary with your job on that, you could automatically be underpaying them for their skills and experience.
Right, perpetuating the inequality, right.
Exactly. So that's an example of where governments can step in to remove hindrances, if you will. When it comes to if you're a nonprofit, it all depends on who you are. I mean, for churches, I think it's pretty easy. I mean, the Bible is very clear about who we're supposed to care for, right? All the people that Jesus cared for, the downcast, the widow, the poor, the hungry. And our pastor was just preaching from Micah the other week about he has shown thee, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of thee, but to justly love mercy and to walk humbly with thy God, right? And the pretext for that was the people, the Israelites, both the northern and the southern kingdom at the time, were ignoring these principles, right? So, so if churches are ignoring justice and mercy, then God has a problem with that, right? And so,
right. I agree.
This is so I think so the thing is that theoretically we know as congregations, but like, how do you put that into practice? That's not always obvious. And certainly advocating for things like housing and education and food and political justice, and all these things are areas that churches can wade into. I know there is a separation between church and state, but there are areas that churches can get into while still maintaining that separation, but also meeting God's mandate, right?
Right. Well, our presiding bishop has been very clear on that issue. He says that advocacy on behalf of the groups you mentioned is a spiritual discipline, and that we need to speak out and be engaged in the public square. It doesn't infringe on our church state issues at all. So, Bill, do you have any questions there in the chat you would like to pull out?
There's 3 questions in the chat. I'll just go in order. And I may paraphrase a little bit, folks, so feel free to chime in if I'm saying it wrong. So Dana, thinking of all the many policy opportunities that you kind of highlighted in the report. I wonder if you, and one of the questions I think is kind of coming up in my mind, and I'm reading into this in the audience as well, is which are the most beneficial, like think about it from a financial standpoint. So Julia Andrews asked about minimum wage. Do you have any thoughts on the relative merits of that? How beneficial it is comparatively? Any comments?
I knew someone was going to ask that. It's kind of a loaded question. And I think, in terms of, if I think if a business has a scope, meaning they have the means to raise minimum wages, then they should. So for example, last week, Walmart raised wages for its employees because they had a great year, which makes sense. That's the ideal, that businesses share their excess profits with labor, right? Which is something that Walmart's doing. That means they did really well, and instead of just giving it all to the shareholders or holding on to it at the top of the pyramid, they're sharing it with labor. It becomes more difficult when businesses don't have that capacity, which is the case for a lot of smaller businesses. So right now there's legislation being considered, and it's not it's not new legislation. It's actually pretty old. It's been around for a number of years to raise wages to the federal minimum wage to $15 per hour. Now, that may make sense in a place like New York City or the Washington, D.C. area where it's more expensive to live, but it may not make sense in, say, rural Idaho, right? So there's got to be there have to be some guardrails that make sense for the region in terms of what minimum wage makes sense, not only in terms of the standard of living, but such that businesses can do it. And the truth of the matter is that you can raise the minimum wage and you can lift a number of people out of poverty, but you're also going to have a number of people who are going to lose their jobs because some businesses are not going to be able to pay everyone. And so they say, well, we're actually going to let, the least productive person go, or we're just not going to hire any more people. So so there's both good and bad. So that's why it's a loaded question. In theory, in a perfect world where the business can afford it, absolutely, I think that they should pay their people, and people who are adequately paid are happier, but also they are lifted out of poverty and they are contributing more greatly to society. But the reality is, for businesses that can't do it, they're going to be sacrifices. And so the question is, what are we willing to put up with? What are we willing to live with?
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to bring up another one that Ginny put into the chat. So this is relating to the comment about labor mobility, right? So I've often heard this before from economists. Well, if you would just move to where the jobs are, right, you'll have better opportunities. Certainly true, and I think a common reaction many of us have is, yeah, easier said than done. Factor into that the redlining or residual redlining, restrictions on that kind of mobility. So I'm just curious, from your standpoint and the research you've done, how viable is that as a opportunity, on a broad level in terms of that really making a difference? Really, what opportunities are there to promote more labor mobility in the U.S. and what are the restrictions on that?
That's a great question. And again, ideally, people should be able to move to where the jobs are. And over the last decade, since the great financial crisis, that was very difficult for many people to just pick up and move. First of all, you have to sell if you own a house, you have to sell it, right? If no one's willing to buy it, where are you going? You're stuck, right? I think mobility is much easier for younger people who don't have families and tethers and can just pick up and move and go wherever. And also, if you don't own a house, it's very easy because you're just renting, just go rent somewhere else. So there are definitely limitations to that. But then there are also, considerations around community, right? You're asking people to pick up and move to a place where you may not have a community, right? And that's so important. or you're moving away from family. And so there's this tension, especially with tech sectors where they're cropping up in parts of the country that essentially, the governments have offered tons of tax reprieves and incentives to move there, but they may be quote unquote in the middle of nowhere for minority groups, and they're just not comfortable going there. So I think that there definitely are the tensions. There's only so much that you can ask, and then the realities of being able to just pack up your house and move to somewhere else. So I would say that answer is more viable for a younger person who's may not have a family. They have parents hopefully, but they don't have a spouse and children and those kinds of things. In terms of and again that goes back to difficulty in selling a home, also relates to past practices in terms of redlining, where you may own a home, but it may be in a neighborhood that has been underinvested in historically, and so the value of your home may not be as high, right? It may be difficult for you to move out because no one wants to move in. But then you also bring up the whole issue around gentrification, right? So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and that was always a kind of a dirty word, because you'd have you basically had poor groups of people being moved out little by little, of areas that they had been in traditionally, and now all of a sudden, an apartment is now worth 3 times what it used to be. And so you can't afford to rent. And so you move, right? Unwillingly. And so, you have these huge issues around gentrification of communities. It's just so complex. So, again, this report just gives the kind of macro 30,000 foot types of answers, but it doesn't necessarily get into the nitty gritty details and the practicality of these things.
Right.
Well, and thanks for that comment. I mean, I think that is, the report is the data, and it's very powerful, right? I think what I'm getting from a lot of what you're saying, Dana, is when you start talking about policy, things get a lot more complex, and you get offsetting effects, and I think that's a lot of what you alluded to. So here's another question from Kathy that is, I actually had the same thing was kind of running through my head as you were going through the presentation, and I'll paraphrase it as when the dollars that you're talking about, the lost opportunity, that kind of runs through the whole report, is that a true opportunity to gain? So for example, when you're closing the gap, you're assuming that we're raising incomes or raising opportunity to the level of not of whites, and if so, is that a total net gain, or is there a zero sum effect in some of that data? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's kind of, it is zero sum if you're not willing to grow the pie, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the best way to explain it is if you're a business and if a business says, well, I have 50 people, and if I give, Janet the raise, then Jim doesn't get the raise, then it's zero sum. Right. But if you're a business and you say, well, maybe I can have 51 people, right, as opposed to just 50, well, then I'm growing. And so any company that says, well, this is zero sum, it means that they're not growing, or they're even shrinking. And that's a hard thing for a business to admit to, that they don't have capacity to grow. But, we also think about those same arguments were made, years ago with regards to women in the labor market, saying, well, if you hire Janet, then you can't, that you're taking away a job from Jim. Well, maybe Jim is subpar, maybe he didn't deserve the job, whereas Janet did, right? And she's a better employee. And now, we don't think about it. Women are, for the most part, are integrated in the labor market. And people aren't talking about zero sum as much as they used to. So I think it's really, broadening your mindset and understanding that this is about growing the pie. And if you think about it, the pie could have been $16 trillion bigger if we didn't have barriers that were put in place on purpose then everybody benefits. So I think that's one way to think about it and to talk about it.
Yeah, thank you for
Dana?
that. And I'll just add, I think, what part of what you're saying, I think, is zero sum is an excuse, right? One of the things we had early on when we were doing these forums, we had Richard Reeves. I don't know if you are familiar with his work, but he did a very, I think, a great presentation and wrote a wonderful book called Dream Hoarders, which talks about, it's actually very relevant to, I think, this demographic on this call, where we have a tendency to, as we want the best for ourselves and for our kids. And some of the effect of that is that we're actually hoarding our opportunities in ways that really aren't intended, right? And I think the one of the fallacies of all ships rise is, I think what he pointed out is, there are times where we have an obligation to allow others to advance, even to our own detriment in some cases. And I think as Christians, I think some of the comments that I've heard in this forum over the weeks is, sometimes you really just have to say, well, only the top quartile can be in the top quartile. And making opportunities for others does mean that you have to accept the possibility that you don't have the advantage you have anymore. So I take what you say, Dana. I think it's very true. I also think it's true that we should be willing to sacrifice a little bit for the greater society and ultimately for the greater good.
Dana, that gets to one of the comments you made to me when we were preparing for this session about some of the pushback you've gotten on the report, to the fact that some people benefit from the way the system is set up right now. And they do see it as a zero-sum change and maybe aren't ready to sacrifice. I mean, can you give us a little insight into the kind of negative reaction you might have gotten?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting. I only, my boss, Captain Mann, who's one of the co-authors, my former boss, gets a lot of pushback because, she's still in the financial sector and you get the zero-sum game pushback. But the pushback that I received was someone thought that, the report was advocating kind of, the creation of a landed gentry, right? Where, it was a big push towards home ownership. From the perspective of the report is that, in America, it's still the case that home ownership is the biggest avenue towards generating wealth and inheritance. And if you have a whole group of people who have not had that opportunity and are still prevented from having that, is that right? I don't know. If we're saying like, you want people to generate wealth and be able to take care of themselves and their children and all these things, but you're not allowing them the venue to do it, well, then that's a problem. So, I mean, that was a major pushback that I received.
Okay, so we've got more comments. I appreciate all the activity in the chat. So Anne, maybe I'll pose one more question and then
We have 2 more minutes by my count. So.
Yeah, so okay, so please forgive those of you that I don't get to your comments. I'm just going to go in order. So Annalise raises a question about the the glaring disparities in the criminal justice system. Any thoughts on how, for example, having a criminal record, what effect that has on the kind of economic disparities that you point out in your report? Any thoughts on that issue?
Yes, having a criminal record is a huge economic disparity, right? Because oftentimes it's very difficult to find a job. And if you can't find a job, then what do? You go back to the activity that got you arrested in the first place, oftentimes, or you find yourself being dependent upon, governments and charity. There definitely needs to be reforms that allow people who had criminal records to get jobs and to, they pay their debt to society and they need to become contributors to society as opposed to, liabilities of society. And then there's also the case of, thinking about, well, how did they get that criminal record? And it's shown that the Rockefeller laws in particular were just so much more punitive. Where you had a gram of crack gets you 10 years automatically, but 10 times much of cocaine gets you less than that. It's like they're both pretty awful bad things, right? But because of that, they had the racial tinge to it, and you just incarcerated tons and tons of Black and Hispanic persons over the years. And so for oftentimes crimes that as serious and as awful as drugs are, their possession of marijuana, some of these things, especially if they're decriminalized, it shouldn't carry as big of a weight in terms of why you were incarcerated. And then you have this criminal record for a small amount of marijuana, and now you can't get a job, and now you're a burden on society. So I think definitely it needs to be reform, a prison reform and a sentencing reform, and also your ability to contribute to society after you've been to prison.
Well, I think, yes,
Go ahead, Annie.
go ahead. I was just going to say, Dana, I think we should thank you for such a wonderful presentation and for the slide deck that you shared with us, which we can share with everyone. You've opened our eyes to a lot of areas where I think that there is scope for us to be involved and to help. We had some really interesting comments, including the one from Bill about thinking of how we as people of faith should address this. And thank you for addressing that too. I hope that we can stay in touch, and maybe as we go forward from time to time, seek your wisdom on some of these things as well.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you again for the invitation.
I hope you have a terrific day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.